Lady Catherine Whitmore stood in the shadows of the grand ballroom, watching her husband dance with yet another woman while whispers followed her like poison. "Barren after 3 years," they said. "Poor Lord Whitmore, trapped with a wife who cannot give him an heir." The Tun's cruelest tongues had branded her a failure. Cast aside by her own family and scorned by society's elite, what they didn't know was that beneath her silk gown, life stirred. A secret she guarded with trembling hands pressed against her still flat stomach. The child growing within her belonged not to her cold husband, but to Alexander Sinclair, the Duke of Ravenwood, the kingdom's most coveted, bachelor and the one man whose love had slipped through her, fingers like sand. But what happens when a barren woman's greatest shame becomes the kingdom's most coveted prize? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast pale light through the tall windows of Whitmore Manor, illuminating the dust motes that danced above Catherine's untouched breakfast. She sat alone at the mahogany dining table, her fingers wrapped around her mother's pearl necklace, the only piece of her former life she was permitted to keep. The pearls felt cool against her throat, a barrier between herself and the suffocating expectations of this house. Above the mantelpiece hung the grand Whitmore family portrait, commissioned just last year. Edmund stood proudly beside his parents, his hand resting on his father's chair, while Lady Margaret Whitmore gazed imperiously from her seated position. Catherine was nowhere to be seen in the painted legacy, as if she had never existed at all, still refusing to eat properly. "I see." Lady Margaret's voice cut through the morning quiet as she swept into the dining room, her black morning dress rustling with each calculated step. Even 3 years after her husband's death, she wore grief like armor, wielding it to maintain control over every aspect of the household. Catherine straightened, forcing herself to meet her mother-in-law's cold gray eyes. "I find I have little appetite these mornings." Little appetite. Lady Margaret's lips pursed with disapproval. "How convenient. Another of your feminine ailments, no doubt. Dr. Pemberton says such delicate constitutions are often the cause of." She paused meaningfully. "Certain failures," the words hit their intended mark. Catherine's hand instinctively moved toward her stomach before she caught herself, transforming the gesture into smoothing her morning dress. The secret growing within her seemed to pulse with awareness, as if it too understood the precariousness of its existence. Edmund entered the dining room with the measured stride of a man carrying invisible burdens. At 32, he possessed the kind of refined handsomeness that made mothers push their daughters forward at social gatherings. Yet his eyes held a disappointment that had deepened with each passing month of their childless marriage. Mother, Catherine. He nodded to each woman with equal formality before taking his seat at the head of the table. The footman immediately appeared with his breakfast. Eggs prepared exactly as he preferred, toast cut into precise triangles, tea steeped for exactly 4 minutes. "I've arranged another consultation," Lady Margaret announced without preamble. "Dr. Whitley comes highly recommended for treating women with your particular difficulties, Catherine. He has had remarkable success with several ladies of quality." Catherine's stomach lurched, though whether from morning sickness or anxiety she could not say. "That is very thoughtful. But you hardly think at all, it seems." Lady Margaret's voice carried the sharp edge of a woman accustomed to absolute obedience. 3 years, Catherine. 3 years without so much as a hopeful sign. The Whitmore line cannot continue through wishful thinking. Edmund set down his teacup with deliberate care. "Mother, perhaps we might discuss this privately." "Why? So Catherine can continue to live in denial? She is part of this family, Edmund, though she seems determined to forget her obligations." Lady Margaret's gaze fixed on Catherine like a hawk studying prey. Or perhaps there are reasons she wishes to avoid medical examination. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine felt her cheeks burn, knowing that any reaction would be scrutinized for signs of guilt. She had become expert at reading the undercurrents of conversation in this house, where every word carried multiple meanings and silence itself could be interpreted as confession. "I will see Dr. Whitley if you think it best," Catherine said quietly, her voice steady despite the turmoil beneath. She would have to trust Dr. Harrison to prepare for this eventuality, to have explanations ready that would satisfy without revealing the truth. Edmund's expression softened slightly, perhaps mistaking her acquiescence for hope rather than desperation. "There is no shame in seeking help, Catherine. We both want the same thing." But that was where he was wrong. Edmund wanted an heir to carry the Whitmore name, a child who would validate their marriage and secure his mother's approval. Catherine wanted to protect the life growing within her, to find some way to navigate the impossible maze of deception that her situation demanded. They were not allies in this endeavor, though neither fully understood why. After breakfast, Catherine retreated to her private sitting room, the one space in the house where she could breathe without feeling observed. Here, surrounded by books and the small watercolor paintings she had completed during happier times, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth that terrified her most. Every passing day brought her closer to a revelation that would destroy not just her own life, but the lives of everyone she had ever cared about. She placed her hand over her stomach, feeling nothing yet but knowing everything had changed. The child within her carried the blood of two great houses, but its very existence was proof of a betrayal that society would never forgive. Soon, there would be no hiding the evidence of her greatest joy and her deepest shame. The ivory envelope arrived with the afternoon post, its elegant script immediately recognizable despite the years that had passed. Catherine's hands trembled as she broke the wax seal, her heart hammering against her ribs as she read the formal invitation within. His Grace, the Duke of Ravenwood, requests the honor of your presence at the announcement of his engagement to Lady Victoria Sterling, Saturday evening, the 15th of October, at Ravenwood House. The words blurred before her eyes as memories flooded back with devastating clarity. 2 years ago, in the conservatory at her cousin's estate, Alexander had pressed a letter into her hands, a letter she had hidden away like a precious relic, too painful to read yet too cherished to destroy. Now, alone in her sitting room, Catherine retrieved that letter from its hiding place behind her collection of poetry books. The paper had yellowed slightly, but Alexander's bold handwriting remained as vivid as the day he had written it. My dearest Catherine, by the time you read this, you will be preparing for your wedding to Whitmore. I know I have no right to speak of this now, when duty has already decided our fates, but I cannot let you go without telling you what lives in my heart. You are the sun that lights my days and the moon that guards my dreams. If circumstances were different, if I were not bound by my father's debts, and you were not promised to secure your family's future, I would fight the world itself to make you mine. But we are not free to choose love over obligation. I understand why you accepted Whitmore's proposal. Your family's survival depends upon the match, and I have nothing to offer but a title weighted down with financial ruin. Perhaps someday, when I have rebuilt what my father lost, when you have fulfilled your duties as a wife, fate will be kinder to us. Until then, know that every beat of my heart belongs to you. Whatever husband claims your hand, your soul will always be mine, as mine is eternally yours. Forever devoted, Alexander. Catherine pressed the letter to her chest, remembering how she had cried over those words on her wedding night, while Edmund waited patiently in the adjoining room. She had married for duty, as ladies of her station always did, but her heart had remained with the man who understood the impossible choices that duty demanded. 3 months later, at her cousin's Christmas ball, duty had collided with desire in a way that changed everything. Alexander had returned from his travels abroad, his family fortune restored through shrewd investments and a profitable arrangement with American shipping companies. He was no longer the penniless second son who could not compete with Edmund's stable prospects. The memory of that night still made her skin burn with shame and longing. One dance had led to a walk in the moonlit garden, and a conversation about regrets had become something far more dangerous. In the shadow of an ancient oak tree, with snow falling like stars around them, Alexander had kissed her with all the passion their letters had contained, and she had responded as if her very soul depended on that moment of connection. What followed was madness. 3 clandestine meetings over the course of a week, each one a betrayal of everything she had been raised to honor. But Alexander's touch had awakened something in her that Edmund's dutiful embraces never could, a fire that consumed rational thought and moral certainty alike. When he whispered that he loved her, that he would find a way to make her his wife properly, she had believed him with the desperate faith of a woman drowning in a loveless marriage. Then reality had intruded. Edmund had announced their extended stay in London, removing any possibility of further secret meetings. Alexander had been called away on urgent business matters that would keep him abroad for months, and Catherine had been left with the consequences of those stolen moments, consequences that now moved within her body like a secret only she could feel. The irony was not lost on her that society branded her barren while she carried the child of the man every mother wished to secure for her daughter. Alexander's son grew beneath her heart while she endured whispers about her failure to conceive, protected by the very shame that threatened to destroy her. Sarah. Her lady's maid knocked softly before entering with the evening tea service. The young woman had been with Catherine since her marriage, a constant presence who had witnessed both her mistress's unhappiness and her brief, dangerous joy. "Will you be responding to His Grace's invitation, my lady?" Sarah asked carefully, her eyes noting the letter still clutched in Catherine's hands. Catherine stared at the invitation again, knowing that accepting would mean facing Alexander while carrying his child, watching him pledge himself to another woman while their secret burned between them. But refusing would raise questions she could not answer, suspicions that might lead to discoveries she could not survive. "Yes," she whispered, folding both letters with careful precision. "We shall attend His Grace's engagement celebration." Ravenwood House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors until the entire ballroom seemed to shimmer like a jeweled box. Catherine stood at the entrance beside Edmund, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they were announced to the assembled guests. She wore her finest emerald silk gown, chosen specifically because its empire waist would disguise any subtle changes to her figure and around her throat. Her mother's pearls caught the light like captured stars. "Quite a spectacle," Edmund murmured, as they descended the marble staircase. Ravenwood had certainly recovered from his father's financial difficulties. Catherine forced a smile, though her heart raced at the thought of seeing Alexander again. Among her gloves and reticule, she had tucked a small rose corsage, not to wear, but to carry as a reminder of happier times. Alexander had once told her that pink roses matched the flush in her cheeks when she laughed, and she had pressed one from their last meeting between the pages of her prayer book. The receiving line moved with agonizing slowness. Catherine watched as couples ahead of them greeted their host and his bride-to-be, observing the easy charm with which Alexander accepted congratulations and the graceful poise of Lady Victoria Sterling beside him. Victoria was everything Catherine was not, blonde where Catherine was dark, petite where Catherine was tall, and possessed of the serene confidence that came from never having known genuine hardship. "Lord and Lady Whitmore," the announcer called, and suddenly Catherine found herself face to face with the man whose child she carried. Alexander had always been handsome, but success had refined his features into something almost devastating. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his evening clothes cut by London's finest tailors, and his blue eyes held the kind of warmth that made every person feel as though they were the only one in the room. When those eyes met Catherine's, something flickered behind them, recognition, longing, and perhaps a shadow of confusion. "Whitmore, delighted you could join us," Alexander said, extending his hand to Edmund with practiced ease. "And Lady Whitmore." His voice dropped slightly as he turned to Catherine, and she felt the familiar flutter in her chest that his presence had always provoked. "You look radiant this evening." Catherine curtsied deeply, using the moment to compose herself. "Your Grace, allow me to congratulate you on your engagement." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, but she spoke them with perfect social grace. "Catherine, how lovely to see you again," Lady Victoria interjected, her smile bright and apparently genuine. "I was just telling Alexander that we must have you and Lord Whitmore to dinner soon. It has been far too long since we've had a proper conversation." The irony was exquisite. Victoria spoke as if they were old friends, when in truth they barely knew each other beyond the superficial acquaintance of London society. Catherine wondered what Alexander had told his fiancée about their past, if anything at all. As they moved into the ballroom proper, Catherine became acutely aware of Alexander's presence even when he was across the room. She could track his movements without looking directly at him, could feel the weight of his gaze during the brief moments when their eyes met across the crowd. When he danced with Victoria, Catherine found herself studying the way they moved together, perfectly synchronized, socially appropriate, and utterly without the electric tension that had always crackled between her and Alexander. "You seem distracted tonight," Edmund observed during their own dance. "Are you feeling quite well?" Catherine started, realizing she had been staring too intently at the couple across the dance floor. "Forgive me. The heat is rather overwhelming. Perhaps some air? The terrace doors are open." But Catherine could not risk the privacy of the terrace, not with Alexander so near, and her emotions so unsteady. Instead, she suggested they find refreshments, steering them toward the safer crowds near the buffet tables. It was there. As she sipped champagne she could not taste and made conversation she could not follow. That disaster struck in the form of an innocent question. "Lady Whitmore," called Lady Pemberton, an elderly dowager known for her sharp tongue and sharper memory. "I was just telling Lord Harrington about the time you and his Grace were such devoted dance partners at the Ashford Christmas ball. Do you remember? You must have danced together 4 times that evening. Quite scandalous, really. But you both looked so enchanting together." The blood drained from Catherine's face, as every person within hearing turned to look at her with renewed interest. She could feel Alexander's attention like a physical force, though he stood 20 feet away. Edmund's hand tightened slightly on her arm, not possessive but protective, as if he sensed some danger he could not identify. "I'm afraid I don't recall," Catherine lied smoothly, though her heart hammered against her ribs. So many balls, so many dances. They all blur together after a while. Lady Pemberton's eyebrows rose with evident disbelief, but before she could press further, the orchestra began the evening's final waltz, and Alexander appeared at Catherine's side as if summoned by the music itself. "Lady Whitmore, would you honor me with this dance?" Dr. Harrison's private study smelled of leather and medicinal herbs, a sanctuary of discretion tucked away on a quiet street far from the fashionable quarters where most physicians attended to society's ailments. Catherine sat in the worn velvet chair across from his desk, her hands folded carefully in her lap while he reviewed the notes in his medical journal, pages filled with observations about treating barren women that served as perfect cover for her true condition. "The nausea has subsided, somewhat," she reported in response to his gentle questioning, "though I find certain foods still disagreeable." Dr. Harrison nodded, making careful notations that anyone reading them would interpret as symptoms of feminine weakness rather than early pregnancy. At 63, he had built his reputation on treating delicate ladies with understanding and absolute confidentiality. His gray whiskers and kind eyes had witnessed more secrets than a priest, and like a priest, he carried them in silence. "Perfectly normal for your condition," he said quietly, glancing toward the door to ensure their privacy. "You are progressing well, my dear. Another month, perhaps 6 weeks, and concealment will become more challenging." Catherine's hand moved instinctively to her stomach, where the slight thickening of her waist was still easily disguised by careful corseting and strategic draping. "And the deception you mentioned? The possibility of adjusting the timeline?" Dr. Harrison set down his pen and regarded her with the serious expression of a man about to deliver uncomfortable truths. "It can be done, but it would require significant planning and some cooperation from your household staff. We would need to create a believable story of conception coinciding with your marriage, which would mean falsifying certain medical records and perhaps arranging for witnessed episodes of morning sickness at strategically chosen times." The weight of what he was proposing settled on Catherine's shoulders like a leaden cloak. More lies, more deception, more people drawn into a web that seemed to grow more tangled with each passing day. "There is another matter," Dr. Harrison continued, his voice dropping even lower. "Lady Margaret has made inquiries about consulting with Dr. Whitley regarding your fertility. He is less sympathetic to women's need for privacy than I might wish." Catherine's blood chilled. Dr. Whitley was known for his invasive examination methods and his tendency to share his findings with husbands in great detail. If he discovered her pregnancy, there would be no hiding the timeline discrepancy. "What would you suggest?" "I will write to Dr. Whitley expressing my professional concerns about subjecting you to additional stress during this delicate time. Perhaps suggest that recent treatments are showing promise and should be given time to prove their efficacy." Dr. Harrison's eyes held the wisdom of a man who had navigated similar deceptions before. "Buy yourself time, my dear, but understand that time is not unlimited." Catherine left the physician's office with a sense of dread that seemed to grow heavier with each step. The carriage ride home took her through the fashionable shopping district, where ladies of quality emerged from milliners and drapers with packages tied in ribbons. They looked so carefree, these women whose greatest concerns were the cut of a sleeve or the shade of a bonnet. Catherine envied them their simple worries, their uncomplicated lives. At home, she found Edmund in his study, correspondence scattered across his desk in neat piles. He looked up as she entered, his expression brightening with the hopeful attention he had shown her increasingly often since their discussion about seeking medical help. "How did your appointment with Dr. Harrison progress?" Catherine had prepared for this question during the carriage ride. "He believes there may be some improvement in my condition. He has prescribed a new regimen of tonics and suggests patience while they take effect." Edmund's face lit with genuine pleasure. "Excellent news. I knew consultation with a specialist would prove beneficial." He rose from behind his desk and crossed to where she stood, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Catherine, I want you to know how much I appreciate your willingness to seek treatment. I know these matters are difficult for women to discuss." His kindness made her deception even more painful. Edmund was not a cruel man, merely one trapped by the same social expectations that imprisoned her. He had married her believing he was gaining a wife who would provide him with children and domestic tranquility. Instead, he had gotten a woman who could offer neither, though for reasons he could never suspect. That evening brought an unexpected visitor. Lady Margaret swept into the drawing room where Catherine sat with her needlework, her face carrying the particular expression of triumph she wore when she had discovered something she considered significant. "Catherine, I have just had the most illuminating conversation with Mrs. Harrington. She mentioned seeing you at Dr. Harrison's office today, and it occurred to me that you have been visiting him with unusual frequency these past weeks." Catherine's needle stilled in the embroidery hoop. "Dr. Harrison has been very attentive to my health concerns. Indeed, so attentive that one might wonder what those concerns entail." Lady Margaret settled into her favorite chair with the careful precision of a cat preparing to pounce. "Mrs. Harrington also mentioned that you seemed rather agitated at His Grace's engagement ball, quite unlike your usual composed self." The connection Lady Margaret was drawing was subtle but unmistakable. Catherine forced herself to continue stitching, though her hands wanted to tremble. "I fear I found the evening rather warm and crowded. Nothing more significant than that. Of course." Lady Margaret's smile was sharp as glass. "Though I confess myself curious about your history with His Grace. Lady Pemberton's comments about your past dancing partnership were most intriguing." Catherine set aside her needlework and met her mother-in-law's gaze directly. "I have danced with many gentlemen over the years, Lady Margaret. I hope you do not consider that scandalous behavior. Not scandalous, no, but perhaps worth observing more closely." Lady Margaret rose with fluid grace. "I have always believed that a woman's behavior tells its own story, Catherine. And lately, your story has become quite fascinating." The false belly pad lay hidden beneath Catherine's chemise like a shameful secret made manifest. Sarah had crafted it with remarkable skill, using layers of cotton batting sewn into a silk pouch that could be gradually enlarged as the supposed pregnancy progressed. When properly positioned and secured with ribbons, it created the illusion of early pregnancy that would align with their carefully constructed timeline. "It feels so wrong," Catherine whispered as Sarah helped her dress for breakfast, adjusting the padding to create the subtle roundness that would suggest conception shortly after her marriage to Edmund. "What feels wrong is the position they've put you in." "My lady," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the fierce loyalty of a servant who had become something closer to a confidant. "You're protecting your child the only way you can." Catherine studied her reflection in the looking-glass, turning sideways to observe the gentle swell that now curved beneath her morning dress. The deception was convincing, but it felt like wearing a costume for a role she had never auditioned for. Soon she would need to reveal this supposed pregnancy to Edmund and Lady Margaret, spinning a tale of newfound hope while carrying another man's child. The breakfast revelation unfolded exactly as she and Dr. Harrison had planned. Catherine entered the dining room with carefully composed excitement, her hand resting protectively over the false curve of her belly in a gesture calculated to draw attention. "Edmund," she began, settling into her chair with the particular care of a woman mindful of her condition, "I have wonderful news to share." Edmund looked up from his correspondence, his expression shifting from polite interest to focused attention as he registered her posture and tone. "Dr. Harrison's treatments have proven most effective, I believe. That is, he has confirmed." Catherine allowed herself to appear overcome with emotion, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. "I am with child." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. Edmund's face transformed, cycling through disbelief, joy, and something approaching wonder as he processed her words. Lady Margaret's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with shaking hands. "Catherine, are you certain?" Edmund's voice was barely above a whisper. "Dr. Harrison examined me yesterday. He estimates I am perhaps 2 months along." The lie came smoothly, supported by the evidence of her altered figure and the morning sickness she had genuinely experienced. Edmund rose from his chair so quickly that it scraped against the floor, crossing to where she sat and dropping to one knee beside her chair. His hands hovered near her waist as if she were made of spun glass. "May I?" he asked, and at her nod, placed his palms gently against the fabricated curve of her belly. His expression was so tender, so filled with hopeful joy, that Catherine felt her heart break a little more. "A Whitmore heir," Lady Margaret breathed, and for the first time since Catherine had known her, the older woman's voice held genuine warmth. After all these years, finally a child to carry on the line. The weeks that followed passed in a blur of careful performance. Catherine played the role of expectant mother with growing confidence, allowing herself to be pampered and protected in ways that felt both wonderful and terrible. Edmund transformed from a dutiful husband into an attentive guardian, monitoring her every comfort and canceling social engagements he deemed too strenuous. The most challenging aspect was managing the physical progression of her supposed pregnancy. Each morning, Sarah helped adjust the padding to reflect the appropriate stage of development, gradually increasing the size while Catherine practiced the changing posture and movements of expectant motherhood. The Baron's wife carried much the same way, Sarah observed during one of these sessions. Small at first, then all at once she seemed to bloom. Very natural looking, my lady. Catherine appreciated Sarah's efforts to make the deception seem ordinary, but she could not escape the weight of what they were creating. Edmund had already begun discussing nursery preparations and interviewing potential wet nurses. He spoke of their child's future with such certainty and pride that Catherine sometimes forgot the baby would not be his at all. The most dangerous moment came when Lady Margaret suggested announcing the pregnancy, publicly at the Ashford Ball, a grand autumn celebration that would bring together most of London society. Think of the triumph, Catherine, Lady Margaret said, her eyes bright with anticipation. After all their whispers about your barrenness, to appear before them carrying the next generation of Whitmores. It would be quite the vindication. Catherine's stomach clenched at the thought of such public exposure. The more people who knew of her supposed pregnancy, the more witnesses there would be to any discrepancies in timeline or circumstance. Perhaps we should wait a bit longer, she suggested carefully, until I am further along and the pregnancy more established. But Edmund was already warming to his mother's idea. Catherine, darling, there is no shame in celebrating this blessing. Let the world see how wrong they were about us. As Catherine nodded her agreement to the public announcement, she realized that each step deeper into this deception made retreat more impossible. Soon, all of London would know of the Whitmore heir, and the weight of expectation would become a prison from which there could be no escape. Dr. Harrison's pen scratched across the parchment with deliberate precision, each word carefully chosen to support the elaborate fiction they had constructed. The forged medical records would show a clear progression of Catherine's recovery from barrenness, complete with detailed observations about her improving health and the successful conception that had finally blessed the Whitmore marriage. These documents will withstand scrutiny from any physician, Dr. Harrison assured Catherine as he blotted the ink. I have backdated entries to show consistent treatment beginning shortly after your marriage, with gradual improvement leading to conception in early August. Catherine studied the falsified timeline, her heart heavy with the weight of each fabricated entry. And if Dr. Whitley should request to examine me, I have already written to him, expressing my professional opinion that your pregnancy is progressing normally under my care. Given the delicate nature of your previous difficulties, I have strongly advised against any additional examinations that might cause distress. The web of lies was becoming so intricate that Catherine sometimes lost track of which version of the truth she was supposed to remember. Sarah helped her maintain the deception at home, while Dr. Harrison provided medical legitimacy, but each new participant in their secret made discovery more likely. Meanwhile, across London, Alexander Sinclair was conducting his own investigation into the circumstances that had led to Catherine's sudden announcement of pregnancy. Something about the timing troubled him, not because he suspected the child was his, but because the woman he remembered would never have hidden such joyful news from society for so long. He had engaged a discreet inquiry agent, Mr. Thornfield, whose reputation for gathering information without creating gossip had served several members of the nobility well. Thornfield's initial report had been puzzling rather than enlightening. The lady has been visiting Dr. Harrison with unusual frequency, Thornfield reported during their private meeting. But curiously, these visits began well before any announcement of conception. Most expectant mothers do not require such intensive medical attention until much later in their confinement. Alexander frowned, his mind turning over possibilities that made little sense. What else have you discovered? Lord Whitmore has been exceedingly generous in his praise of his wife's condition, discussing the coming heir with anyone who will listen. Yet servants in the household mention that Lady Whitmore has been unusually secretive about her health, often sending away her regular maid when meeting with visitors. These details painted a picture that Alexander could not quite decipher. Catherine had always been private, but such extreme discretion about a pregnancy seemed excessive, even for a woman who had endured years of speculation about her fertility. At Whitmore Manor, the strain of maintaining multiple deceptions was beginning to show. Catherine found herself exhausted by the constant performance, the need to remember which version of events she had told to whom, and the growing complexity of timing her false pregnancy to match societal expectations. Edmund's joy, while genuine and touching, made every day more difficult. He had begun reading to her belly each evening, convinced that their child could hear his voice. He spoke of plans for their son's education, for he was certain it would be a son, and had already commissioned a miniature portrait of Catherine to hang in the nursery. "He will have your eyes," Edmund said one evening as they sat in the drawing room, his hand resting on the padded curve of her false belly. "And perhaps my father's steady temperament, the perfect combination for a future lord." Catherine smiled and nodded, but internally she wondered what Edmund would say if he knew the child would have Alexander's striking blue eyes and decisive nature instead. Every conversation about their future child felt like another layer of betrayal. Lady Margaret had become Catherine's unexpected ally in the deception, though for entirely selfish reasons. The prospect of a Whitmore heir had transformed her from critical adversary to protective guardian, fussing over Catherine's diet and insisting she rest more frequently. "You must be more careful about your activities," Lady Margaret scolded when she found Catherine in the garden one afternoon. "Women in your delicate condition should not be exerting themselves with such vigorous exercise." The irony was not lost on Catherine that Lady Margaret's newfound solicitousness was based entirely on the false pregnancy, while she had shown no such concern during the actual early stages when Catherine had genuinely needed support. But the most dangerous crack in their carefully constructed facade came from an unexpected source. Sarah, returning from an errand in town, brought disturbing news that made Catherine's blood run cold. "My lady," Sarah whispered, as she helped Catherine prepare for bed, "I overheard something at the market today. Mrs. Pemberton was discussing your condition with the baker's wife, and she mentioned something odd. She said Lord Blackthorne had been asking questions about you, specifically about your health and your visits to Dr. Harrison." Catherine's hand stilled in the process of removing her jewelry. Lord Blackthorne was Edmund's cousin, a man with a reputation for collecting information that could be used to his advantage. If he was investigating her supposed pregnancy, it could only mean he suspected something that might prove profitable to him. "What sort of questions?" Catherine asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Questions about timing, my lady, about when your symptoms began, and whether they seemed consistent with the announcement you made to the family." Sarah's expression was grave. "Mrs. Pemberton seemed to think he was simply concerned for family welfare, but I fear his interest may be less innocent." As Catherine lay awake that night, the false padding removed, and her real pregnancy beginning to show its natural progression, she realized that their elaborate deception had drawn the attention of exactly the sort of person they could least afford to notice them. Lord Blackthorne's involvement could unravel everything they had worked so carefully to construct. Catherine's locket had become her most treasured and most dangerous possession. Inside the delicate gold case, she had placed 2 miniature portraits, one of Edmund painted on their wedding day, his face reflecting dutiful optimism, and one of Alexander sketched from memory during those precious weeks when she had believed love might conquer obligation. Now she wore it hidden beneath her chemise, a secret testament to the impossible loyalty that tore her heart in 2 directions. The emotional weight of her deception had grown unbearable. Each morning she watched Edmund's face light up as he greeted her with tender kisses to her forehead and gentle inquiries about her comfort. His transformation from distant husband to devoted protector would have been everything she had dreamed of during the early months of their marriage, if only the child inspiring his devotion had been his own. "I have commissioned a rocking horse from the finest craftsman in London," Edmund announced over breakfast, his enthusiasm making him appear years younger, hand-carved oak with real horsehair mane. "It will be ready well before the baby arrives." Catherine smiled and expressed appropriate delight, but internally, she calculated the growing list of preparations that would become meaningless when the truth inevitably surfaced. The nursery Edmund was preparing with such love would stand as a monument to her betrayal, every carefully chosen detail a reminder of the dreams she had shattered. Meanwhile, Alexander's engagement to Lady Victoria proceeded with clockwork efficiency, each social obligation fulfilled with perfect propriety, despite the growing restlessness that plagued his private hours. Victoria was everything a duke's wife should be: accomplished, beautiful, and possessed of the kind of serene disposition that promised peaceful domestic harmony. Yet Alexander found himself studying her face during their conversations, comparing her animated expressions to Catherine's more subtle emotional depths. Victoria's laughter was musical and frequent, but it lacked the rich complexity of Catherine's rare, genuine smiles. When Victoria discussed their future together, her plans seemed borrowed from a handbook of appropriate ducal behavior, rather than springing from personal desire. "We must decide on the guest list for the Christmas ball," Victoria said as they took their customary afternoon ride through Hyde Park. "Mother suggests limiting it to 200 of the most significant families, but I believe we could accommodate more if we open the green drawing room as well." Alexander nodded absently, his attention caught by a woman walking along the path whose posture reminded him achingly of Catherine. The figure was too distant to identify clearly, but something about the careful way she carried herself, as if protecting something precious, made his chest tighten with unwelcome longing. "Alexander?" Victoria's voice held a note of concern. "You seem terribly distracted lately. Are business matters troubling you?" He turned back to his fiancée with an apologetic smile. "Forgive me. I fear I have been preoccupied with estate concerns." The lie came easily, though it solved nothing about his growing inability to focus on their shared future, when his thoughts remained anchored in a past he could not change. The crisis that would reshape everything began with the most innocent of encounters. Catherine, accompanied by Sarah on a visit to her modiste, found herself face to face with Alexander outside Madame Rousseau's establishment on Bond Street. He was alone, having apparently dismissed his groom to conduct some private business, and the meeting occurred with such suddenness that neither had time to prepare their customary social masks. "Catherine," he breathed, her name escaping his lips like a prayer before he could stop himself. "Your Grace." Catherine's voice was steady, but her hand moved instinctively to her stomach in the protective gesture that had become second nature. Alexander's eyes followed the movement, taking in the obvious evidence of her condition, with an expression that shifted from surprise to something more complex. Quick mental calculations flickered across his features as he processed the implications of her clearly advanced pregnancy against the timeline of their last meeting. "Congratulations on your happy news," he said carefully, but his voice carried undertones that made Catherine's pulse quicken with anxiety. "Edmund must be overjoyed." "He is indeed. We are both very blessed." Catherine fought to keep her tone light and social, aware that Sarah stood close enough to overhear every word while passers-by moved around them on the busy street. "When do you expect?" The question seemed innocent enough, but Alexander's eyes held an intensity that suggested he was calculating more than polite interest. "Early spring," Catherine replied, the answer she had rehearsed countless times. "Dr. Harrison assures us everything is progressing normally." Alexander nodded slowly, but something in his expression suggested that her carefully constructed timeline had not satisfied whatever suspicions were forming in his mind. "You look radiant. Motherhood clearly agrees with you." As they parted with conventional pleasantries, Catherine felt the dangerous certainty that Alexander's sharp intelligence had detected something amiss in their brief encounter. The way he had studied her face, the calculated nature of his questions, the subtle emphasis he had placed on certain words, all suggested a man gathering information, rather than simply exchanging social courtesies. That evening, Catherine sat in her private sitting room with her needlework abandoned in her lap, staring at the fire while her mind raced through possibilities. If Alexander suspected the child was his, what would he do with that knowledge? Would he confront her privately, or would he approach Edmund directly? Either scenario promised disaster, but in different ways. She opened her locket and studied the two faces inside, wondering how she had become a woman capable of loving two men so differently, yet so completely. Edmund deserved a wife who could give him her whole heart, while Alexander deserved honesty about the child he would never know was his. But circumstances had made such straightforward devotion impossible, trapping her in a web of competing loyalties that grew more tangled with each passing day. The baby stirred within her, a reminder that this was no longer simply about her own happiness, or even about the men who shaped her world. Soon there would be a child, whose very existence would force truths into the light that she had fought so desperately to keep hidden. The photograph arrived with the morning post, tucked innocuously between invitations and household bills. Catherine's blood turned to ice as she stared at the damning image. Herself and Alexander captured in the shadows of the conservatory at the Pemberton garden party 2 weeks prior. Their faces turned toward each other in unmistakable intimacy. The photographer had caught the moment when Alexander's hand had briefly touched her cheek, a gesture of comfort when she had confided her fears about Lady Margaret's growing suspicions. Lord Blackthorn's calling card accompanied the photograph, along with a brief note written in his careful script. Perhaps we might discuss matters of mutual interest this afternoon. I shall call at 3 o'clock. Catherine's hands trembled as she studied the evidence of her indiscretion. The photograph could be interpreted in only one way by anyone who saw it, as proof of an ongoing affair between the Duke of Ravenwood and Lady Whitmore. Combined with her pregnancy, it would create a scandal that would destroy not just her own reputation, but Alexander's engagement and Edmund's standing in society. She had barely composed herself when Sarah announced Lord Blackthorn's arrival. Edmund's cousin entered the drawing room with the confident bearing of a man holding winning cards, his thin face bearing the satisfaction of a successful predator. At 42, Blackthorn had survived primarily on his ability to extract advantage from other people's secrets, and Catherine realized she had become his latest opportunity. Lady Whitmore, how radiant you look. Pregnancy certainly agrees with you. His smile was sharp as a blade, though I must say, the timing of your blessed condition has been quite remarkable. Catherine remained standing, refusing to be seated while he loomed over her with barely concealed triumph. I'm afraid I don't understand your meaning, Lord Blackthorn. Don't you? How curious. He settled himself into Edmund's favorite chair with deliberate presumption. I have been most interested in your recent activities. Your frequent visits to Dr. Harrison, your careful avoidance of certain social gatherings, and most fascinating of all, your renewed acquaintance with His Grace the Duke of Ravenwood. He produced the photograph with theatrical flourish, placing it on the table where the afternoon light would illuminate every damning detail. A touching scene. One might almost mistake it for an intimate moment between lovers, rather than casual acquaintances. Catherine's mind raced through possible explanations, but the evidence was too clear for denial. His Grace was merely offering comfort during a difficult conversation. If you choose to interpret kindness as something more sinister, that reflects poorly on your own character, not ours. But you see, dear Catherine, interpretation is everything, and I believe society would find my interpretation quite compelling, especially when combined with certain mathematical curiosities regarding your pregnancy. Blackthorn's eyes glittered with malicious intelligence. Shall we discuss what you are willing to do to prevent such interpretations from becoming public knowledge? The blackmail demand when it came was more complex than Catherine had expected. Blackthorn did not simply want money. He wanted access to the Whitmore fortune through a business partnership that would give him significant control over Edmund's investments and properties. More dangerously, he wanted Catherine to provide him with information about other society families that might prove profitable to his schemes. You have access to drawing rooms where secrets are shared freely among ladies, he explained with casual cruelty. Information about financial difficulties, family scandals, marital problems. Such knowledge can be quite valuable when properly applied. Catherine realized that accepting his demands would transform her from victim into accomplice, making her complicit in the destruction of other innocent people. But refusing meant exposure that would ruin everyone she cared about. I need time to consider your proposal, she said carefully. Of course, but not too much time. I understand His Grace's wedding to Lady Victoria is scheduled for next month. It would be tragic if certain revelations were to disrupt such a joyous occasion. His smile was poison wrapped in silk. I shall return tomorrow for your answer. After Blackthorn departed, Catherine sat alone in the drawing room, staring at the photograph that held her future hostage. She had been so careful about their brief encounters, never imagining that someone might be watching with a camera, documenting moments that had felt precious, but now appeared sordid under the lens of blackmail. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor that threatened to shatter what remained of Catherine's composure. Alexander arrived without announcement, his face bearing the grim determination of a man who had reached the end of his patience with unanswered questions. We need to discuss certain matters privately, he said without preamble, his eyes noting her obvious distress. I believe we have allowed polite fiction to continue long enough. Catherine felt the walls of her carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. Between Blackthorn's blackmail and Alexander's suspicions, the secret she had guarded so desperately was being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. I don't know what you mean, she began, but Alexander silenced her with a look of profound understanding mixed with determination. The child you carry, he said quietly. I believe we both know the truth about when it was conceived. And I think it's time we discussed what that truth means for all of us. The small glass vial seemed to pulse with malevolent promise in Catherine's trembling palm. Dr. Morrison, a discreet physician who attended to ladies in desperate circumstances, had assured her that the contents would bring about a swift and relatively painless resolution to her condition. Many women in your position have found this the most merciful solution, he had said with the clinical detachment of a man who had witnessed too many tragedies born of society's unforgiving moral code. Catherine had sought him out in desperation after Alexander's confrontation the previous afternoon. When faced with his direct questions about the child's paternity, she had neither confirmed nor denied his suspicions, but her silence had been answer enough. Alexander had left with the grim promise that he would not allow his child to be raised as another man's heir, regardless of the scandal such revelation would create. Now, sitting in her private chambers with the poison hidden in her jewelry box, Catherine contemplated the unthinkable. If she no longer carried Alexander's child, Blackthorn's blackmail would lose its power. The photograph would become mere evidence of a brief indiscretion, rather than proof of ongoing adultery. Edmund would mourn the loss of his hoped-for heir, but he would never need to learn the truth about its parentage. But the cost of such a solution went beyond the life growing within her. Catherine pressed her hand to her stomach, feeling the subtle movements that had become her secret. Joy. This child was innocent of the complicated circumstances that had created it, deserving of life regardless of the chaos its existence had unleashed. Meanwhile, Alexander was conducting his own desperate calculations. His investigation into the Whitmore family finances had revealed disturbing information about Blackthorn's involvement in several questionable business ventures. The man was more dangerous than a simple blackmailer. He was actively working to gain control of multiple family fortunes through manipulation and coercion. His Grace wishes to see you immediately, Thornfield reported during their morning meeting. Lord Blackthorn has been making inquiries about your engagement to Lady Victoria, specifically about your family's historical connections to certain American shipping interests. He appears to be gathering information that could be used to your disadvantage. Alexander's jaw tightened as he realized the scope of Blackthorn's ambitions. The man was not simply targeting Catherine. He was building a network of leverage that could control several of London's most influential families. Catherine's pregnancy had been merely the opening move in a much larger game. At Whitmore Manor, Edmund's growing concern about his wife's health had reached the point where he was considering summoning additional medical consultants despite Dr. Harrison's reassurances. Catherine's obvious distress, which she attributed to the normal anxieties of expectant motherhood, had begun to manifest in ways that genuine pregnancy could not explain. Perhaps we should postpone the announcement at the Ashford ball, Edmund suggested over luncheon. His brow creased with worry. You seem so troubled lately, darling. I wonder if the excitement might be too much for your delicate condition. Catherine's heart lurched at his consideration, knowing that postponement would only delay the inevitable reckoning. No, Edmund. I believe the announcement should proceed as planned. It will put an end to speculation and allow us to focus on preparing for the baby's arrival. Lady Margaret, who had been observing Catherine with increasing sharpness, chose that moment to interject with a comment that made Catherine's blood chill. I received an interesting visit from Lord Blackthorn this morning. He expressed great concern about family welfare and suggested that certain precautions might be advisable given the delicate nature of Catherine's condition. The implicit threat was unmistakable. Blackthorn was positioning himself as a protective family member while simultaneously tightening the screws of his extortion. Catherine realized that her time for decision-making had effectively ended. She would need to choose between succumbing to his demands or finding some other way to neutralize the threat he posed. That afternoon brought Dr. Harrison's urgent summons. When Catherine arrived at his office, she found him pacing with obvious agitation, his usual calm professionalism replaced by genuine alarm. My dear, I have received disturbing information about your situation. Dr. Whitley contacted me today with questions about your treatment that suggest someone has been feeding him details about our consultations. He specifically asked about the timeline of your pregnancy and whether I had any concerns about discrepancies in your condition. Catherine sank into the chair across from his desk, feeling the walls of her deception closing in from every direction. What did you tell him? I maintained professional discretion, but I fear his inquiries indicate that someone with knowledge of medical matters has been discussing your case with him. Someone who understands enough about pregnancy to ask the right questions. The realization that struck Catherine was worse than any threat Blackthorn had made directly. If he had medical knowledge or access to someone who did, Her carefully constructed deception about the pregnancy timeline could be exposed through scientific examination rather than mere speculation. The false padding, the forged records, the elaborate performance she had maintained, all of it could crumble under the scrutiny of a physician determined to find inconsistencies. "Dr. Harrison," Catherine said quietly, her hand moving to the hidden vial in her reticule. "If a woman in my position were to, if circumstances made it impossible to continue, what would be the safest method to end a pregnancy without detection?" Dr. Harrison's face went ashen. "My dear lady, surely you are not considering such a drastic measure. The risks alone, please. I need to know my options." The physician studied her with the grave attention of a man recognizing genuine desperation. "Catherine, whatever pressures you are facing, there may be other solutions. Have you considered that the truth, however difficult, might be preferable to the path you are contemplating?" But Catherine knew that the truth would destroy not just herself, but Edmund's reputation, Alexander's engagement, and the child's chance for any kind of normal life. The poison in her reticule seemed to whisper of an escape from impossible choices, even as her heart rebelled against such a solution. The secret marriage certificate lay hidden in Alexander's private study, sealed within a leather portfolio that had remained untouched since his father's death. The document revealed the shocking truth that the late Duke of Ravenwood had secretly married Alexander's mother 2 years before their public ceremony, making Alexander's claim to the title unquestionably legitimate and invalidating several competing claims that had long threatened the family's stability. More importantly, the certificate proved that Alexander's inheritance included properties and investments that had been thought lost to creditors, substantially increasing his wealth and political influence. The document had the power to reshape the entire balance of aristocratic society, making him one of the most powerful dukes in England, rather than merely one of the most desirable. Alexander studied the parchment with growing understanding of how dramatically this knowledge could alter his current circumstances. With such substantial resources at his disposal, he could challenge Blackthorn's schemes directly rather than trying to navigate around them. But the revelation would also raise questions about why he had remained engaged to Lady Victoria when financial necessity no longer demanded the match. Meanwhile, the betrayal that would shatter Catherine's last illusions was taking shape in her own household. Sarah, the maid she had trusted with her deepest secrets, sat in Blackthorn's private study receiving payment for information that would complete his manipulation of the Whitmore family. "The lady has been visiting Dr. Morrison," Sarah reported, her voice steady, despite the guilt that gnawed at her conscience. "She asked me to procure certain items that suggest she may be considering drastic measures regarding her condition." Blackthorn's eyes lit with cruel satisfaction. This development would give him even greater leverage over Catherine, allowing him to position himself as the family's protector against scandal, while simultaneously controlling their response to his demands. And the Duke of Ravenwood? Has he made any further contact? "He sent a message yesterday requesting a private meeting, but my lady refused to see him. She seems terrified that any further association will expose whatever secret they share." Sarah hesitated before adding, "My lord, I fear she may harm herself if the pressure becomes too great. She is not as strong as she appears." Blackthorn waved away her concern with irritation. Emotional women were tools to be used, not people deserving of consideration. "Continue your observations. I want to know immediately if she takes any action that might interfere with our arrangements." Edmund, oblivious to the machinations surrounding his family, had spent the morning interviewing architects about expanding the nursery into a proper children's wing. His joy about the coming heir had transformed him into the kind of devoted husband Catherine had dreamed of marrying, making her deception even more torturous to maintain. "I've commissioned a portrait of you to commemorate this blessed time," he announced over dinner, his face glowing with paternal pride. "Master Reynolds will begin the preliminary sketches next week. I want our son to know how radiant his mother looked while carrying him." Catherine forced a smile while calculating whether she would be able to maintain her deception long enough for such a sitting. The portrait would become another piece of evidence documenting the lie she lived, preserved for future generations, who would never know the truth about the child's parentage. The crisis that would reshape everything began with Lady Victoria's unexpected visit to Ravenwood House. Alexander's fiancée had noticed his growing distraction and decided to address it directly, bringing with her the kind of forthright determination that had originally attracted him to her character. "Alexander, I believe we need to discuss the future of our engagement," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from his desk with elegant composure. "You have been increasingly absent, even when physically present, and I think we both deserve honesty about where your affections truly lie." Alexander studied her face, recognizing the intelligence and dignity that had made her seem like an ideal partner for a marriage of social convenience. But Victoria deserved more than convenience, and he was no longer certain he could provide the devotion she warranted. "Victoria, he began, but she interrupted with a raised hand. "Please don't insult my intelligence with protestations of continued affection. I have observed you at social gatherings, and I know the difference between distraction and disinterest." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes held a sadness that made Alexander realize how unfair his emotional withdrawal had been to her. "You deserve a husband who can love you completely," Alexander said quietly. "I fear I am not that man." Victoria nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already suspected. "Is there someone else? Someone whose claim on your heart predates our arrangement?" The directness of her question demanded honesty. "There is someone, yes, but circumstances make it impossible for us to be together." "Impossible or merely difficult?" Victoria's smile was sad but understanding. "I have found that circumstances can often be changed by people with sufficient determination and resources. Perhaps the discovery of your father's secret marriage certificate provides the resources, and your feelings supply the determination." Alexander stared at her in shock. "How could you possibly know about the certificate?" "My father's solicitor mentioned it during discussions about our marriage settlement. He thought it might affect the financial arrangements." Victoria rose with graceful dignity. "Alexander, I release you from our engagement, not because I do not care for you, but because I care enough to want you to find the happiness that clearly lies elsewhere." As she prepared to leave, Victoria paused at the door with a final observation that would haunt Alexander's thoughts. "Whatever circumstances you believe make your happiness impossible, remember that love constrained by fear rarely survives, while love supported by courage can overcome remarkable obstacles." The confrontation began with mathematical precision. Edmund stood in the doorway of Catherine's sitting room holding a calendar and Dr. Harrison's appointment ledger, his face bearing the terrible calm of a man whose world had just crumbled into comprehensible pieces. Behind him, Lady Margaret waited with the satisfied expression of a prosecutor who had finally assembled an irrefutable case. "Catherine," Edmund's voice was steady, but Catherine could hear the fractures beneath its surface. "I believe we need to discuss certain discrepancies in the timing of your condition." Catherine's hands stilled on her embroidery, the needle frozen midair as she processed the evidence arrayed against her. She had known this moment would come, had rehearsed explanations and denials, but faced with Edmund's quiet devastation, all her prepared words seemed inadequate. "I received a visit from Dr. Whitley this afternoon," Edmund continued, moving into the room with the careful steps of a man navigating broken glass. "He expressed concerns about Dr. Harrison's treatment records and requested permission to examine you personally. When I mentioned this to Dr. Harrison, he became quite agitated and suggested the examination might be problematic." Lady Margaret stepped forward, no longer content to let her son handle the interrogation alone. "Dr. Whitley's expertise in these matters is considerable, Catherine. He was able to determine, simply from Dr. Harrison's evasive responses, that your pregnancy timeline does not align with the conception date you claimed." Catherine set aside her needlework and rose to face them both, her chin lifting with the kind of dignity that had carried her through 3 years of social humiliation. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting," Edmund said, his voice breaking slightly on the words, "that the child you carry was not conceived within our marriage. That the heir I have been celebrating, the son I have been planning for, belongs to another man." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Catherine could deny it, could demand proof beyond medical speculation, could attempt to maintain the fiction that had protected everyone she loved. But looking at Edmund's face, seeing the pain that went deeper than betrayal, touching the very foundations of his identity as husband and future father, she found she could not add more lies to the weight he already carried. "Edmund," she began, but he silenced her with a gesture of profound weariness. "Please, don't compound this with more deception." He moved to the window, staring out at the garden where he had imagined teaching his son to ride and hunt. "I need to know who he is. The father of your child. I need to understand how my wife, whom I have tried to love and protect, came to betray everything we built together." Before Catherine could respond, the drawing room door burst open with a violence that made them all turn in shock. Alexander strode into the room with the authority of a man whose patience had been exhausted by circumstance, his eyes blazing with determination that brooked no further delay or deception. "The child is mine," he announced without preamble, his gaze fixing on Edmund with the directness of one gentleman addressing another on matters of honor. Lady Whitmore carries my son, conceived during a brief period when we both forgot our obligations to duty in favor of our obligations to love. Lady Margaret's gasp was audible across the room, but Edmund's reaction was worse. A terrible stillness that suggested something inside him had broken beyond repair. He turned from the window slowly, his face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and finally a kind of hollow acceptance. "The Duke of Ravenwood," Edmund said quietly, as if testing the words for their capacity to inflict pain. "Of course. The most eligible bachelor in England. Why would my wife be content with a mere baron when she could have a duke?" "It was not like that," Catherine said desperately, stepping toward her husband with hands extended in supplication. "Edmund, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" "How you made a fool of me in front of all society. How you let me boast about the Whitmore heir while knowing he carried another man's blood. How you watched me plan for his future while you and your lover laughed at my ignorance." Edmund's voice rose with each word, years of quiet disappointment finally finding expression in rage. Alexander stepped forward, his own anger evident but controlled. "No one has been laughing, Whitmore. This situation brings joy to no one. Catherine has suffered more than you can imagine, torn between duty to you and love for— Love?" Edmund's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Don't speak to me of love while standing in my drawing room claiming my wife's child as your own. If you loved her, you would have married her yourself, instead of leaving her to me, while you pursued more advantageous matches." The accuracy of that accusation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Everything Edmund said was true. Alexander had allowed practical considerations to override his feelings for Catherine, had chosen duty over desire until it was too late to claim either with honor. Lady Margaret, who had been observing this exchange with the fascination of a spectator at a particularly dramatic theater performance, finally found her voice. "This scandal will destroy us all. The Whitmore name, our standing in society, Edmund's political prospects, everything ruined by your selfishness." Catherine watched the three people she cared most about tear each other apart with words that could never be unsaid. Weapons forged from her own deceptions and failures. The child within her moved restlessly, as if sensing the chaos its existence had unleashed upon the adult world it would soon enter. Alexander's ducal coronet sat on his desk like a crown of thorns, its sapphires and diamonds catching the firelight as he contemplated the power it represented and the price he was willing to pay to protect the woman he loved. The secret marriage certificate lay beside it, proof that his authority extended far beyond what society had previously recognized. With these advantages, he could challenge not just Blackthorn's blackmail, but the entire social structure that had made their love seem impossible. "Your Grace," Thornfield reported during their emergency meeting, "the situation has escalated beyond our initial projections. Lord Blackthorn has taken your public claim of paternity as an opportunity to demand immediate payment of £50,000, threatening to expose additional details about Lady Whitmore's condition that would make the scandal even more devastating." Alexander's jaw tightened as he processed this information. What additional details could he possibly possess? Evidence that Lady Whitmore obtained substances from Dr. Morrison that suggest she considered ending the pregnancy. Blackthorn presents this as evidence of moral corruption that would destroy any sympathy society might have for her situation. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. The thought that Catherine had been driven to such desperation, that she had faced the choice between destroying their child or destroying everyone she loved, made his determination crystallize into something approaching fury. And if I refuse his demands, he has scheduled meetings with the editors of 3 society papers, promising revelations that will make Lady Whitmore's disgrace the most discussed scandal of the season. He also suggests that Lord Whitmore has been challenged to defend his wife's honor through more traditional means. Alexander understood the implication immediately. Edmund, despite his devastation, was still bound by the codes of gentlemanly conduct that required him to defend Catherine's reputation, even after learning of her betrayal. A duel would satisfy society's expectations while potentially eliminating one of the men caught in this impossible triangle. At Whitmore Manor, the aftermath of the confrontation had settled into a silence more terrible than the shouting that had preceded it. Edmund sat in his study with a bottle of brandy and a pair of dueling pistols that had belonged to his grandfather, contemplating the mathematics of Ho, Nor and revenge. Catherine's betrayal had struck at the foundation of his identity as husband and protector, leaving him with the choice between public humiliation and potentially lethal action. Catherine herself had retreated to her chambers, where the physical symptoms of stress had begun to threaten the pregnancy she had fought so hard to protect. Dr. Harrison attended her with grave concern, his usual confidence shaken by the complexity of treating a woman whose emotional turmoil might prove more dangerous than any physical complication. "The bleeding has stopped, but you must remain absolutely still," he warned, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. "Any additional shock or agitation could result in the loss of your child." Catherine nodded weakly, her hand pressed protectively over the slight curve of her belly. The irony was not lost on her that after considering ending the pregnancy herself, she was now fighting desperately to preserve it. The child had become more than evidence of her shame. It was the only tangible proof of the love that had transformed her from dutiful wife to passionate woman. Lady Margaret had taken control of damage control with the ruthless efficiency of a general organizing strategic retreat. She had already begun circulating carefully crafted explanations of Catherine's nervous condition, while positioning the family to weather whatever scandal might emerge. Her calculations were coldly practical. If Edmund died in a duel, Catherine's disgrace would make her unsuitable as guardian of the Whitmore estate. Lady Margaret could step in as protector of family interests while banishing the woman who had brought such chaos to their lives. The most unexpected development came with a visit from Lady Victoria, who arrived at Whitmore Manor with the composed dignity of a woman who had made peace with dramatic change. She requested a private audience with Catherine, claiming the right of one woman to speak honestly to another about the man they had both loved. "I have no intention of creating additional difficulties," Victoria assured Catherine as they sat in the morning room, carefully positioned away from household traffic. "I wanted you to know that I released Alexander from our engagement before yesterday's revelations. I had already recognized that his heart belonged elsewhere." Catherine studied the other woman's face, searching for signs of anger or resentment, but finding only a kind of sad wisdom. "Lady Victoria, I never intended for any of this to happen. If there had been any other way, there rarely is, when love collides with duty." Victoria's smile was gentle but knowing. "I have watched you both at social gatherings, seen the way you exist in each other's orbit, even when trying to maintain appropriate distance. Such connection cannot be commanded or dismissed by social convenience." Victoria paused, then delivered the information that would change everything. "Alexander possesses resources he has not yet revealed publicly. His father's secret marriage certificate proves claims to properties and investments that would make him one of the wealthiest dukes in England. He has the power to protect you from whatever scandal emerges, if you will allow him to do so." As Victoria prepared to leave, she offered one final piece of advice that would haunt Catherine's thoughts. "Sometimes the most courageous choice is not to sacrifice everything for propriety, but to fight for the love that gives life meaning. Your child deserves to know both parents who chose each other, not just the one who was convenient." That evening brought the challenge Catherine had been dreading. Edmund appeared at her door wearing the formal dress that indicated his intention to demand satisfaction for the dishonor done to his name and family. His face had aged years in the span of a single day, but his resolve appeared unshakable. "I have sent Alexander Sinclair a challenge," he announced with quiet formality. "We will meet at dawn to settle this matter as gentlemen should." The birth certificate lay crisp and official on Dr. Harrison's desk, the ink still wet from his careful penmanship. "Alexander James Sinclair," it read, "son of Catherine Whitmore and Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Ravenwood." The document represented both triumph and tragedy, official recognition of the child's true parentage, achieved through circumstances that had nearly cost Catherine her life. The labor had begun during the height of the public scandal that erupted when news of the impending duel spread through London society. Catherine's premature contractions, brought on by the stress of watching the men she loved prepare to potentially kill each other, had forced Dr. Harrison to make an emergency decision that would change everything. The child cannot wait for society to resolve its conflicts, he had told the assembled family members as Catherine's cries echoed through Whitmore Manor. "We must focus on preserving both mother and baby, regardless of whatever other concerns demand attention." Edmund, despite his devastation and anger, had proven himself a gentleman in the truest sense during the crisis. When Catherine's condition became critical, he had set aside thoughts of honor and revenge to ensure she received the best possible care. His actions during those harrowing hours had revealed the depth of character that had originally attracted Catherine to him, even if love had never truly followed. Alexander had abandoned all pretense of social propriety, arriving at Whitmore Manor within minutes of receiving word about Catherine's condition. His presence in the house of the man he had wronged should have been scandalous, but crisis had temporarily suspended normal social rules. He paced the hallway outside Catherine's chambers like a caged wolf, his usual composed dignity replaced by raw anxiety about the woman and child he might lose. The moment of birth had been both beautiful and terrible. Catherine's son emerged into the world with his father's striking blue eyes and strong lungs, his cries announcing his arrival to a household. Still reeling from revelation and conflict, Dr. Harrison placed the baby in Alexander's arms with the solemnity of a man recognizing historic significance. "Your son, your grace," he said quietly. And in those words, the fiction of the Whitmore heir finally dissolved completely. Edmund's reaction had surprised everyone, including himself. Standing in the doorway of the nursery, watching Alexander hold the child that should have been his, he felt not the expected surge of renewed anger, but a kind of profound sadness mixed with unexpected relief. The burden of pretending love where none existed, of building a future on foundations of duty rather than affection, had been lifted from his shoulders. "He's beautiful," Edmund said quietly, approaching to study the infant's features. "He has Catherine's stubborn chin, but everything else is clearly yours." Alexander looked up at the man he had wronged, seeing in Edmund's face the kind of nobility that had nothing to do with titles or bloodlines. "Whitmore, Don't," Edmund interrupted gently. "We have both been victims of circumstances larger than our individual choices. The child is innocent of our failures." Lady Margaret's response had been more pragmatic, but equally surprising. Faced with the reality of a healthy grandson, even one whose parentage complicated family dynamics, her protective instincts had overcome her social prejudices. She had immediately begun planning how to position the family to weather the scandal while protecting the child's future interests. "Society will adapt," she declared with the confidence of a woman who had navigated 4 decades of aristocratic politics. "Illegitimate children of dukes have been acknowledged before. With proper handling, this could even enhance our family's connections to the Ravenwood fortune." The public announcement, when it came, had been crafted with surgical precision to minimize damage while establishing new realities. Alexander's acknowledgement of his son was presented as a belated recognition of passion that had overcome duty, while Catherine's role was positioned as that of a woman caught between competing obligations. Edmund emerged as the dignified husband who had chosen family honor over personal revenge. Blackthorn's schemes had crumbled in the face of Alexander's public honesty and financial resources. The secret marriage certificate had been revealed, establishing Alexander's wealth and eliminating any leverage Blackthorn had hoped to maintain. More importantly, Alexander's direct challenge to Blackthorn's character had resulted in the man's social exile, his reputation destroyed by revelations about his systematic manipulation of multiple families. Truth, properly presented, is more powerful than blackmail, Alexander explained to Catherine as she recovered from childbirth. Blackthorn's strength lay in forcing us to hide from scandal. Once we embraced honesty, his weapons became worthless. Catherine sat propped against pillows in her bed, their son nursing contentedly at her breast, while morning light streamed through windows that no longer seemed like barriers between her private shame and public judgment. The child who had been the source of so much deception and fear had become the center of a new kind of family, unconventional but authentic. "What happens now?" she asked, studying Alexander's face for signs of the regret or reservation that might complicate their hard-won happiness. Alexander reached out to touch his son's tiny fist, his expression soft with wonder and determination. "Now we build the life we should have chosen from the beginning, if we had possessed the courage to fight for love over convenience." Edmund's final gift to them both had been his blessing, formally releasing Catherine from their marriage vows and acknowledging Alexander's right to claim both mother and child. His dignity in defeat had restored much of the respect society had initially withdrawn, positioning him for a future marriage based on genuine affection, rather than family obligation. The wedding rings Alexander had, commission bore no resemblance to the conventional band Catherine had worn during her marriage to Edmund. These new symbols were crafted from Welsh gold and set with stones that told their story. Sapphires for the constancy that had survived separation, diamonds for the strength that had endured scandal, and emeralds for the hope that had sustained them through impossible circumstances. Catherine stood before the mirror in her private chambers at Ravenwood House, studying her reflection as Sarah, fully restored to her position after confessing her role in Blackthorn's schemes, arranged the veil that had belonged to Alexander's grandmother, The lace seemed to shimmer with accumulated blessings from generations of ducal wives who had navigated their own challenges with varying degrees of grace and success. "You look radiant." "Your Grace," Sarah said softly, using the title that still felt foreign to Catherine's ears. The transformation from scorned Barren's wife to Duchess had occurred so rapidly that Catherine sometimes felt she was inhabiting someone else's life. The ceremony itself was deliberately intimate, held in the chapel at Ravenwood House rather than the grand cathedral that would have been traditional for a ducal wedding. Alexander had insisted on privacy, wanting their vows to be exchanged away from the curious eyes of society spectators who came seeking entertainment rather than witnessing genuine commitment. Edmund attended as Catherine's family representative, his presence a testament to the forgiveness and understanding that had emerged from their shared ordeal. He had found peace in releasing Catherine from obligations that had never been freely chosen, and his dignity during the transition had earned him respect that extended beyond mere social courtesy. Marriage should be a choice, not an arrangement, he had told Catherine during one of their final private conversations. "I hope Alexander understands what a remarkable woman he is gaining, and I trust he will protect the happiness I could never provide you." Dr. Harrison performed the ceremony, his role as both family friend and keeper of their secrets making him the natural choice for such an intimate celebration. His words emphasized the triumph of truth over deception, the courage required to choose love over convenience, and the responsibility they both bore to ensure their son grew up understanding the power of authentic commitment. "You have both learned that love constrained by fear diminishes, while love supported by courage grows stronger," he said as they exchanged rings. "May you remember this lesson during whatever challenges the future may bring." Lady Victoria's attendance had surprised many observers, but Catherine understood it as the gesture of a woman who had chosen grace over resentment. Victoria's wedding gift, a first edition of poetry by Elizabeth Barrett Browning, included an inscription that revealed her generous spirit. "To love that is genuine enough to survive scandal and strong enough to overcome obstacles. May your union be blessed with the happiness that only authentic choice can provide." The most meaningful moment came when Alexander placed his mother's ring on Catherine's finger while their infant son slept in the arms of his new grandmother. Lady Margaret had embraced her role with enthusiasm that went beyond mere social necessity, finding in her grandson the continuation of family legacy that had always been her primary concern. "This child will know love from his first breath," Lady Margaret declared during the wedding breakfast. "He will understand that his parents chose each other against all odds, that his existence represents the triumph of authentic feeling over social convenience." The rehabilitation of Catherine's reputation proved less difficult than anyone had anticipated. Society possessed a remarkable capacity for forgiveness when scandal was accompanied by sufficient romance and financial security. Alexander's wealth and position provided protection, while the obvious devotion between the new couple transformed their story from sordid affair to passionate love conquering adversity. The key to their social acceptance had been Alexander's strategic approach to the narrative. Rather than allowing others to define their relationship as betrayal and deception, he had presented it as delayed recognition of a connection that predated Catherine's marriage to Edmund. The timing was awkward, but the emotional authenticity was undeniable to anyone who observed them together. "Let society whisper," Alexander said during their first public appearance as husband and wife at the opera. "We have nothing to hide anymore, and everything to celebrate." Catherine's gradual reintegration into social circles revealed how much her isolation during the Whitmore marriage had been self-imposed, rather than externally mandated. Many women who had seemed to judge her harshly now offered friendship and support, suggesting that her perceived rejection had often reflected her own shame rather than others' actual opinions. The most surprising ally proved to be Lady Pemberton, whose sharp tongue had contributed to Catherine's earlier misery. During a tea party at Ravenwood House, the elderly dowager offered wisdom that reframed Catherine's entire understanding of her social position. "My dear Duchess," Lady Pemberton said with characteristic directness, "society has always been more interested in authenticity than propriety. We may gossip about scandals, but we respect people who have the courage to fight for genuine happiness. Your story will inspire other women to make braver choices about their own lives." As winter gave way to spring, Catherine found herself settling into the rhythm of married life that she had always imagined but never experienced. Alexander's love was not the dutiful affection Edmund had offered, but something more elemental and sustaining, a partnership that enhanced rather than diminished her individual identity while creating something greater than either could achieve alone. The nursery cradle had been handcrafted by the finest woodworkers in London, its intricate carvings telling the story of two great houses united through love rather than political arrangement. Catherine sat in the rocking chair beside it, nursing her son while morning light streamed through windows that overlooked the gardens where she and Alexander had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. Alexander James, called Jamie by his doting parents, had grown into a robust infant whose bright eyes seemed to take in everything around him with intelligent curiosity. At 6 months old, he bore an unmistakable resemblance to his father, though Catherine fancied she could see traces of her own determined chin in his small features. Most importantly, he carried himself with the unconscious confidence of a child who had never doubted he was wanted and cherished. "He has your grandfather's steady temperament," Catherine murmured to Alexander as he entered the nursery, still in his riding clothes from his morning inspection of the estate. The domestic scene, wife, child, and the peaceful routine of family life still struck Alexander as almost miraculous after the chaos and deception that had marked Jamie's conception and birth. Alexander settled into the chair beside Catherine, his hand stroking their son's downy hair with the gentle reverence he brought to all interactions with the child. "Dr. Harrison believes he will be tall like the men in my family, but with your artistic sensibilities." He was quite taken with how intently Jamie studies the paintings in the gallery. The establishment of their household had proceeded with surprising smoothness, helped by the fact that many of the Ravenwood staff had served Alexander's family for generations and possessed the kind of loyalty that transcended temporary scandals. Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper who had helped raise Alexander himself, had taken to Catherine with protective warmth that extended far beyond professional duty. "Her Grace has the gentle strength that makes a true lady," Mrs. Hartwell had confided to the other servants. "His Grace is fortunate to have found a wife who loves him for himself rather than his title." The integration of their extended family had proven more complex but equally rewarding. Lady Margaret had embraced her role as grandmother with enthusiasm that sometimes bordered on possessiveness, while her relationship with Catherine had evolved from hostility through grudging respect to genuine affection. The older woman's protective instincts, once focused on preserving family reputation against Catherine's perceived inadequacies, now centered on ensuring Jamie's future as heir to both the Whitmore and Ravenwood legacies. Edmund's presence in their lives had settled into a pattern that might have seemed impossible during the painful months of revelation and separation. He had married Miss Eleanor Hartwick, a gentlewoman whose genuine admiration for his character had helped heal the wounds left by Catherine's betrayal. More remarkably, he had maintained a friendship with Alexander that honored their shared history while acknowledging the changed circumstances that would always exist between them. "Jamie should know all the people who care about him," Edmund had said during his first visit to see Catherine's son. "Blood relationship matters less than the love adults choose to show children." Alexander's political influence had grown substantially since their marriage, supported by his enhanced wealth and the respect his handling of personal scandal had earned among his peers. Rather than retreating from public life, he had chosen to use his position to advocate for legal reforms that would protect women trapped in loveless marriages and provide more rights for children born outside conventional circumstances. "Our story should serve a purpose beyond our own happiness," he had explained to Catherine during one of their evening conversations. "If our experience can help other families navigate similar challenges with less suffering, then perhaps the pain we endured will have lasting meaning." Catherine had discovered her own voice in charitable work, using her position as Duchess of Ravenwood to support institutions that aided women facing difficult pregnancies and children who needed protection from family scandal. Her personal understanding of shame and social isolation made her particularly effective at connecting with women whose circumstances seemed hopeless. "You survived what felt impossible," she would tell the women who came to her for assistance. "Your current situation may seem overwhelming, but choices exist that you may not have recognized yet." The most profound change in Catherine's life, however, was the simple daily experience of living without deception. After years of carefully monitoring every word and gesture to maintain various fictions, the freedom to be completely honest with her husband created a kind of peace she had never imagined possible. Alexander knew all her thoughts, fears, and dreams, while she understood his ambitions, vulnerabilities, and the deep well of protective love he felt for their small family. Their evening routine had become a sacred time, when they would sit together in the library, Catherine working on correspondence while Alexander reviewed estate business, Jamie sleeping peacefully in a basket beside Catherine's chair. The quiet domesticity of these moments represented everything Catherine had yearned for during her lonely years at Whitmore Manor: partnership, understanding, and the secure knowledge that she was cherished for who she truly was, rather than the role she could perform. "Do you ever regret the choices that brought us here?" Catherine asked one evening, watching Alexander's face in the firelight as he read reports from his American business interests. Alexander looked up, his expression soft with contentment that had replaced the restless ambition that had once driven him. "I regret the pain we caused others, and the time we lost to convention. But I cannot regret the path that led me to you and Jamie. This is the life I was meant to live." The family tree spread across Alexander's desk, like a map of destiny rewritten, its elegant calligraphy documenting the official recognition of Jamie as the legitimate heir to both the Ravenwood dukedom and a significant portion of the Whitmore estate. The document represented more than genealogical accuracy. It was a testament to how love and courage could reshape the rigid structures of aristocratic society. A year had passed since the scandal that had threatened to destroy them all, and London society had moved on to fresher gossip with the fickleness typical of its nature. The Duchess of Ravenwood and her infant son had become fixtures at appropriate social gatherings, their presence no longer causing the whispered speculation that had once followed Catherine's every appearance. "Jamie will inherit more than property," Alexander observed, studying the family tree while their son played on the Persian carpet at his feet. At 15 months old, Jamie possessed the kind of fearless curiosity that sent him exploring every corner of rooms while his parents conducted the business of managing their combined estates. Catherine looked up from the correspondence she was reviewing, letters from women seeking assistance with their own impossible situations, a responsibility she had embraced with the passion of someone who understood the weight of seemingly hopeless circumstances. "He will inherit the knowledge that authentic love is worth fighting for, regardless of social consequences." The transformation of Catherine's reputation from scorned Barren's wife to respected duchess had been remarkable to witness. Her charitable work had earned genuine admiration, while her obvious devotion to Alexander and their son had convinced even former critics that their union represented genuine feeling rather than mere social ambition. More importantly, Catherine had discovered her own voice and strength, no longer the anxious woman who had hidden in shadows during her first marriage. Alexander's political career had flourished as well, supported by colleagues who respected his principled handling of personal crisis. His advocacy for legal reforms protecting women and children had earned him influence that extended far beyond his ducal privileges, positioning him as a progressive voice in an institution traditionally resistant to change. "The marriage reform bill will come to vote next month," Alexander reported during their evening discussion in the library. "If it passes, women in circumstances similar to yours will have legal options that didn't exist when you faced those choices." Catherine felt deep satisfaction, knowing that their painful experience might prevent other women from enduring similar desperation. The bill would allow wives in loveless marriages to petition for separation under specific circumstances, while also providing legal protection for children whose parentage might be questioned due to marital complications. Lady Margaret had embraced her role as Jamie's grandmother with an enthusiasm that had surprised everyone who knew her rigid adherence to social proprieties. The woman who had once scorned Catherine as unworthy of the Whitmore name now boasted to her friends about her grandson's intelligence and charm, conveniently forgetting her previous concerns about bloodlines and legitimacy. "Jamie spoke 3 words yesterday," Lady Margaret announced during her weekly visit to Ravenwood House. "Mama, Papa, and more," clearly indicating superior intelligence. "I have already begun inquiries about the finest tutors for his eventual education." Edmund's friendship with Alexander had deepened over the months, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to ensuring Jamie grew up understanding the complex circumstances of his birth, without being burdened by adult guilt or resentment. Edmund's own marriage to Eleanor had proven successful, providing him with the gentle companionship and domestic tranquility he had originally hoped to find with Catherine. Children should know that adults sometimes make difficult choices for complicated reasons, Edmund had said during one of his visits. Jamie will understand someday that everyone involved did what they believed was right, even when those beliefs conflicted with each other. The most remarkable change had been Catherine's relationship with other members of society. Women who had once seemed to judge her harshly now sought her friendship and advice, recognizing in her story a kind of courage they admired, even if they could not emulate it. Her salon had become a gathering place for intelligent women discussing everything from literature to social reform, creating the kind of intellectual community Catherine had always craved, but never dared pursue during her first marriage. "You have become exactly who you were meant to be," Alexander observed one evening as they prepared for bed. Watching Catherine brush her hair at the dressing table that had once reflected only anxiety and shame. "Marriage to Whitmore constrained your true nature, but our union has allowed you to flourish." Catherine met his eyes in the mirror, seeing reflected there the love that had sustained her through impossible choices and devastating revelations. "We both discovered who we truly were when we stopped trying to be who society expected us to be." Their son's future stretched before them like an unwritten book, full of possibilities that neither parent had been able to imagine during their own constrained youths. Jamie would grow up knowing that his parents had chosen each other against all odds, that love had proven stronger than duty, and that authentic happiness was worth whatever price society demanded for those brave enough to claim it. "He will never have to choose between love and obligation the way we did," Catherine said, settling into Alexander's arms as they listened to their son's peaceful breathing from the adjoining nursery. "That may be the greatest gift we can give him." The pearl necklace that had once been Catherine's armor against social cruelty now rested in the jewelry box as a reminder of survival rather than protection. Tomorrow she would pass it to Jamie's future bride. Whenever that distant day arrived, along with the story of how love had transformed shame into triumph and created a family. From the ruins of convention, the garden rose had bloomed exactly where Catherine and Alexander first acknowledged their love for each other, its deep crimson petals unfurling in the morning sunlight like a promise fulfilled. Catherine knelt beside the bush. Her 3-year-old son Jamie crouched next to her with the intense concentration he brought to all his explorations of the natural world. "Careful, sweetheart," Catherine cautioned, as Jamie reached toward the thorns with the fearless curiosity that marked all his adventures. "Beautiful things sometimes have sharp edges, but that doesn't make them less precious. Like Mama's story?" Jamie asked with the startling perceptiveness that continually amazed both parents. At 3, he possessed an intuitive understanding of the adult world that went far beyond his years, perhaps absorbing through osmosis the complex emotions that had shaped his earliest existence. Catherine smiled, pulling her son onto her lap as they sat together in the garden that had witnessed so much of their family's history. "Yes, darling, sometimes the most beautiful stories have difficult parts, but that makes the happy ending even more special." Alexander emerged from the house carrying their infant daughter, Elizabeth, whose arrival 6 months ago had completed their family in ways Catherine had never imagined possible. Unlike Jamie's dramatic entrance into a world of scandal and revelation, Elizabeth had been born into the peaceful security of established love, her first breath drawing in air untainted by secrets or shame. "She has your stubborn chin," Alexander observed, settling beside Catherine on the garden bench, while Elizabeth gurgled contentedly in his arms. "I suspect she'll inherit your determination along with it." The years had softened the sharp edges of their early trials, transforming painful memories into wisdom that informed their daily choices. Catherine's reputation as Duchess of Ravenwood was now so firmly established that newer members of society knew nothing of her previous struggles, while those who remembered the scandal had either forgotten the details or chosen to focus on the inspiring outcome rather than the controversial circumstances. Jamie had grown into exactly the kind of child Catherine had dreamed of. Raising, confident without arrogance, curious about everything around him, and secure in the knowledge that his parents adored both him and each other. He would enter the world knowing that love was meant to be chosen rather than endured, demonstrated through daily kindness rather than mere duty. "Tell me about the brave lady," Jamie requested, settling against Catherine's shoulder with the comfortable expectation of a child accustomed to stories about his family's history. Catherine and Alexander had agreed to share age-appropriate versions of their story as Jamie grew, wanting him to understand his heritage without burdening him with adult complexities. "Once upon a time," Catherine began, her voice carrying the warm confidence of a woman who had found peace with her past, "there was a lady who thought she had to choose between what made her happy and what other people expected. She was very sad because she believed she couldn't have both. But then the Duke came," Jamie continued, having heard various versions of this tale throughout his short life. And he showed her that brave people can choose love instead of being afraid. Alexander reached over to ruffle his son's dark hair, marveling at how the child had distilled their complex story into such simple truth. That's exactly right. The lady discovered she was much braver than she knew, and the Duke learned that real love is worth fighting for, no matter what obstacles appear in the way. The afternoon brought visitors who embodied the healing that time and truth had accomplished. Edmund arrived with his wife Eleanor and their young daughter, Sarah, whose existence proved that all the adults in Jamie's extended family had found the happiness that had seemed impossible during those dark months of revelation and conflict. "Uncle Edmund," Jamie called, racing across the lawn with the energy of a child whose world was populated by adults who loved him unconditionally. Edmund swept the boy up with genuine affection, their relationship built on warmth, rather than the complicated biology that society typically considered paramount in family connections. Lady Margaret followed more sedately, her arms laden with gifts for both grandchildren, and her face bearing the satisfaction of a woman whose family had not only survived scandal, but emerged stronger for the experience. The woman who had once viewed Catherine as a threat to family honor now spoke proudly of both her daughter-in-law's charitable work and her son-in-law's political achievements. As evening settled over the garden, Catherine found herself standing at the same window where she had once watched Edmund dance with other women, while whispers followed her like shadows. Now the view encompassed a different scene entirely. Alexander playing with both children on the lawn, his laughter carrying across the gardens, while Elizabeth watched from her blanket with wide-eyed wonder. The pearl necklace rested in its box upstairs, no longer needed as armor against the world's cruelty. It waited patiently to be passed on to the next generation, carrying with it the story of how one woman's courage to choose love over convention had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. Catherine's hand moved to rest over her heart, feeling the steady rhythm that had sustained her through impossible choices and delivered her to this moment of perfect contentment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities, but tonight, surrounded by the family love had created and the garden where it all began, she was exactly where she belonged.